Hello and welcome along to this webinar from Edie. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tune in this afternoon. I'm Edie's Deputy Editor, Sarah George, and it's great to be chairing this afternoon's online masterclass session for you all, which we are hosting in association with JRP Solutions. We're hosting this session to fill you in on everything you need to know about preparing your organisation for its obligations under the third phase of the UK Government's Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, commonly known as ESOS Phase 3 for short, after a number of updates were made to the scheme earlier this year. With the assistance of experts from JRP Solutions and the UK Government administrators itself, we'll be looking at scheme deadlines, rules to compliance reporting, going above and beyond, and all of your other FAQ. We do hope to answer all of your key questions about this scheme in this session. So before we get into all of this information, I have some quick housekeeping notes to run through. First of all is on timings. This is a 45-minute session and will run through to 1:45 p.m. British summer time. We have two presentations, one from the Government's Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and one from our partner JRP Solutions. There will then be some time at the end to put your questions to both of our presenters live on air. In the interest of time, we're going to do all of our questions at once in this final part of the session, but you can use the Q&A function on this platform to submit your questions at any point and vote up your favourite questions from other people too. This session is being recorded, so don't worry too much about rushing to take notes. You'll be emailed a recording after the session has finished, and we'll also list some information on access on demand on our website. We have a lot of ground to cover and only 45 minutes to do that in. So without further ado, it's great to introduce our first guest presenter, who you can see on the screen. I have Gary Shanahan, who is the Head of Business and Industrial Energy Efficiency, Tax and Reporting at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So thank you very much for joining, Gary. I can see you on the screen, so I know we've got your mic and webcam. I understand you've also got some slides for your presentation.
Yeah, afternoon all, and yes, definitely great to see such interest in ESOS, and thanks to the organisers for fitting it nicely in the cricket interval at the kind of Ashes test to maximise participation. So yeah, happy if someone can put the slides up and we'll kick off.
Great, I'm sure that was pre-planned. Well, I'll hand over to you, Gary, for our first presentation of the afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, let's move on to the next slide, partly because I'm conscious we don't have long in terms of so I guess a bit of background to ESOS and kind of what it is and what it's trying to achieve and who should be participants in the scheme. So ESOS applies to any large UK business. The legislation actually says undertaking that employs either 250 or more people, FTEs, or has an annual turnover greater than £44 million and an annual balance sheet over 38 million. And I guess for those of you that have been in ESOS in previous phases, you know that slightly changed because the original thresholds were set out in euros, but for this phase are now in pound sterling. But also to be aware that it also applies to organisations that are in the same corporate group as at least one large business. It was introduced in 2014, partly to address kind of key barriers to energy efficiency that were kind of flagged in the UK government's energy efficiency strategy that was published in 2012, particularly access to tailored information on energy saving opportunities, but also kind of issues around business salience of energy efficiency, particularly at the board level. It also kind of acted in allowing the UK to meet an obligation under the Energy Efficiency Directive. And what they're looking to achieve is to identify cost-effective energy efficiency savings from the energy businesses are responsible for across their buildings, industrial processes and transport, and to look at both measures that can be introduced, energy efficiency measures, but also opportunities for things such as behaviour change or improved energy management. rather than just being about energy efficiency measures themselves. Next slide, please. So we're currently in what's known as phase 3 of the scheme. And I guess it allowed us to look at what had been achieved in the first 2 phases, but also to look at ways to kind of reflect any findings that came out of significant evaluation of those previous phases. So we published that evaluation at the link set out here, and also published on a consultation on plans to strengthen the scheme in 2021. And government has set out in the government response that was published about a year ago the changes that we would make in response to the consultation responses, but they were subject to legislation, timetable and scrutiny. But one thing that we weren't doing was changing the eligibility criteria. So those people that met the thresholds on the 31st December 2022 are required to comply in this phase. Next phase. Next slide, please. So there are a number of things that came out of the evaluation, and on which we, in the consultation, broke them down into, I guess, 4 areas that we sought views on. One was in setting stronger standards for ESOS, both in terms of the minimum requirements, but also looking at opportunities. For example, on de minimis, we were conscious that 10% of energy that was subject to the de minimis on, so may not be subject to audit, was quite a lot for some organizations, and meant some significant opportunities were being left out. And for us, actually moving down to 5% still gave the opportunity to kind of leave out those areas that might be disproportionate to audit, but still allow you to look at areas that hadn't been included in previous audits. And for some organizations, for example, allowed them to start to look at issues around transport for the first time, which may have been left out previously. We're also conscious in terms of the quality of audits, and certainly some of the findings by the Environment Agency, where some significant proportion of organizations weren't meeting the minimum standards that when they were audited. So there were needs to improve the quality of the audits in terms of allowing businesses to have better information, and to allow that to be shared in a more consistent way with, for example, other parts of the group, and also to look at ways that you might consider taking forward the outcome of ESOS. We're also conscious and sought views on the interplay between net zero and energy efficiency, and we're conscious that there are some options that are looked through an energy efficiency lens that may not necessarily also meet our objectives on decarbonisation. So one of the things that we've done is work on a net zero standard, and I'll say something more about that in a minute. But we're also conscious of time, so saw that as something that was more for the next phase of ESOS rather than this one. And then we're also conscious in terms of kind of taking forward the opportunities that came out of those audits. So things that we have included in phase 3 are that organizations should target or action plans, and also look at providing additional data for compliance monitoring and enforcement to enable us to ensure that those audits are meeting, I guess, a good level of standard. But there are also things that we didn't bring forward in phase 3, such as net zero, but also some things that we have said we would want to do a further consultation on before thinking about them for phase 4, whether that's extending beyond the existing eligible businesses or whether it's actually requiring mandatory implementation of the recommendations, particularly those at lower paybacks. Next slide, please. So this slide gives a kind of brief view of how will the changes be implemented. So I've mentioned that we're waiting for the legislation to kind of enable the implementation. So, and we expect that should be in the autumn. So we will provide updated guidance that will be published following the laying of the statutory instrument. And I'll go and say something about timing in a minute. We are looking at standardizing the information that's provided and have put something out in terms of, for example, templates. And we're also doing some work on updating the website to allow it to be a modern, accessible and user-friendly digital solution that kind of updates on what we currently have. And then, as I mentioned, the British Standards Institute have done some work on public consultation on the net zero standard for audits. And that's something that should appear later in the year. But as I said, is something that we're thinking about as mandatory for phase 4 rather than required in phase 3. Next slide, please. Conscious I don't have long. So, as I said, we're waiting for the legislation to go through Parliament. The key clauses that enable the changes are part of the energy bill, which is scheduled to go back for its near end stages. So the report stage is scheduled for the 5th of September before the bill returns to the Lords, but we're expecting that should allow relatively swift passage of the bill and allow us to lay the legislation shortly after. But I guess we're also conscious that while we, through the Environment Agency, have put out newsletters to provide participants more detail on the changes, we want to send out the updated details once we have the final legislation through. And if anyone hasn't seen those newsletters, then the help desk to register for them is there. We're also conscious of some organisations may want to provide compliance notifications now that don't necessarily reflect the changes that are coming. So because we're developing the new IT system and because the legislation is yet to be finalised, we're holding off making that disclosure portal available until at least the autumn. But we announced fairly recently through the newsletters that because of the kind of timing of the legislation and the IT system, that we would give participants more time to meet the new requirements and for everyone to meet the same requirements. So we've said that the compliance deadline will move from the 5th of June to the 5th of June 2024 from the 5th of December 2023. That doesn't mean all things and all deadlines will change in the current ESOS. So as I said, the qualification date won't change and the date for calculating the total energy consumption and significant energy consumption won't change. So still needs to include the qualification date. But we, as I said, will provide detail in the guidance. I'm conscious that's a very quick canter through of quite a lot of detail, but hopefully that gives you enough, and I'm happy to deal with any questions later on.
Great, thank you so much for kicking us off this afternoon, Gary, and we have had a first few questions in. Do keep those questions coming and we'll take them all after our second and final presentation. Can I please invite Owen Jones, the Principal Sustainability and Energy Consultant at JRP Solutions, to the screen. Hi, Owen.
Hi.
Great, so I can hear and see you. That's the first hurdle crossed for your presentation. You have slides as well, right?
That's right, yeah.
Great. So I'll just get our webinar team to stick those up and we can all see those there. Great. Owen, I'll hand over to you and come back on at the end to moderate our question and answers.
Thank you. Yeah. So if you could move on to the next slide. So Gary's discussed most of this. There's a qualification. So one of the main changes is changing the representative sample. Must audit a representative sample of 95% of all your energy use rather than the previous 90%. Or it's got to be covered by ISO 50001 accreditation. One thing I'll mention here that I have heard rumors that some auditors out there are still actually working at the 90%, which is currently the law, but this will change. I think that's a little bit short-sighted. Next slide, please. So timelines again. Gary's covered much of this, so it's been changed to the 5th of June next year. One of the main things I would say to everybody on this, if you do need to comply with ESOS and you haven't engaged with the lead assessor, you need to get engaging with the lead assessor soon to make sure that you're going to be compliant. Although the deadline has been extended, there is a shortage of good lead assessors out there. So the other issue is obviously that we still don't know what the full requirements are going to be for compliance. We've got a good idea, but there's still a lot of the detail that needs sorting out. And until the legislation has gone through Parliament, we're not going to know. So there's still quite a lot of uncertainty out there on exactly what is required. And although quite a few of our clients, we've got to the stage where essentially we've done 90% of the work and they could submit compliance now if we knew what was required. There isn't the ability to do that because the website for submitting compliance hasn't been released yet. And something else is Gary was also talking about an implementation plan. So when you've got your opportunities, there is going to be a requirement from an implementation plan. My understanding that won't be required until after the compliance date, which is now the 5th of June, but again, not 100% sure on how whether that's being clarified. Next slide, please. So one of the main things from an auditor and consultant point of view is data. Having good quality data for your ESOS audits is very important. It's a key thing. And also the data needs to be verifiable. So if you get audited by the EA, if your evidence pack gets audited, you need to be able to verify the data you've used to calculate your total energy consumption. And if you haven't got verifiable data, you can estimate some of it, but you have to justify why you've estimated it and justify the method you've used for that estimation. So it is very important to try and develop systems to collect data on a regular basis to make sure that when you're doing your audits and when you're doing your calculation of your total energy consumption, that you've got good quality data available. Now, in recent years, SECR, so the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, a lot of organizations have to do that now, and also do a lot of greenhouse gas reporting is becoming more into the mainstream. Those do give you good data sets, and that data is generally collected on an annual basis. But what you need to be, when you're looking at those data sets, you need to be aware that the boundaries and scopes may be different between ESOS and SECR, for instance. So if you're doing your SECR on an operational control boundary, then in likelihood is it will align with the ESOS requirements. If you're doing it on a financial control boundary, then it may not align. So you need to be careful of those type of things and issues. Another issue we have with data is companies understanding or organizations understanding their organizational structure. So that's something that you should be looking at and making sure, including all of the entities within your organization within the UK, including other companies that have the same overseas parent. Another thing that's going to be required is collection of company numbers and SIC codes as well. That's likely to be required for compliance. Energy metrics, that again is something that should have been done previous ESOSs, but wasn't a requirement. It is going to be a requirement now, and it's thinking about what's the best metric to use to to measure your energy efficiency going forwards. And this is something that potentially might get published. So you want to try and make sure you choose the correct metric. Another bit of data that you're going to need to collect for this phase is the energy conservation measures that have been implemented since the last ESOS. So since 2019, and potentially for energy conservations before that as well, but that's not mandatory. The amount and detail of the data that needs to be collected isn't clear at the moment. Hopefully that's something we can get some clarity on. Another thing that is being asked for is to split the metrics and the energy conservation measures by building, process and transport. Again, the guidance isn't clear and the information isn't clear on exactly how we're going to do this. I'm not really sure how this is actually going to work. Another bit of data that's really important but often gets missed is more difficult to collect is grey fleet. So company car, or not company car, but private car use for company business. And the other one is renewables. So when you're calculating your total energy consumption, if you've got solar panels on the roof, you need to include the electricity generated that's used on site within your total energy consumption. And then the last bit of data that you really need to be thinking about is who is going to sign this off. So it needs to really be somebody on the board of directors, and the regulations around this are being tightened up. So you really need to think about who's the right person to sign this off. Next slide, please. So we've got a few pitfalls here. Sort of mentioned it earlier, but engage a lead assessor as soon as you can if you haven't already done so. And make sure when you're engaging a lead assessor and auditors that they have qualifications and experience in your industry sector. We've had a fair bit of talk about data, so making sure you have good data, making sure you've got systems in place to collect that data. If you don't, it makes the process a lot more time consuming. You get poor accuracy and you get a poor result from the overall process. The uncertainty about what's going to happen and what the actual guidance and requirements are going to be. You've got to not ensuring that you've got a representative sample. So you've covered that full 95% of your total energy consumption with a representative sample, and how many sites do you need to audit for a representative sample? And the current guidance is quite open to interpretation at the moment. I believe that may be tightened up. So I would suggest that you want to be on the side of caution if you want to make sure you're compliant with the new regulations. And the final one is not understanding the cost of inaction. So you've got all these audits that you've done, you've got a number of energy opportunities identified, but if you do nothing with them, what's the cost going to be? So next slide, please. So just quickly, this is a graph of energy bridge, basically, which shows the impact of inaction on the opportunities. This is based on from a phase 2 audit or series of audits we did for a client. And here you can see that the orange bars are the consumption with implementing the measures that have been identified, and the blue bar isn't. So for not taking any action, you're basically going to consume on this basis 70 million more kilowatt hours. So next slide, please. And this is the same when looking at costs, and this is based on forecast costs from 2019. So the cost difference would actually be quite a lot higher based on current unit prices. And that's saying that basically, if you don't act on these opportunities, it will cost you £4 million in 5 years. And that's £4 million off the bottom line. Okay, next slide, please. So getting the most of ESOS. So I would suggest you want to be commissioning some people or getting the audits done if you're doing them internally as soon as you can. Sooner you get the audits, the sooner you can start looking at the opportunities and start implementing those opportunities and saving money and carbon emissions and reducing your carbon emissions. So trying to get the audits done as soon as you can and acting on them. As I've mentioned earlier, making sure that you're using auditors and a lead assessor who's got knowledge in your business or sector. This is, and I believe this is something that again might be coming in through the new legislation, that you've got to justify who you've used for your audits, and justify why they're qualified to do it as well. So I'm not sure if that's coming in this phase or for the next phase. The other trend I'm seeing a lot at the moment is a lot of clients are actually auditing a lot more sites than they need to meet the requirements of ESOS, because they want to get the opportunities and they want to understand where their energy is going and how they can save energy on most of their sites, rather than just a smaller representative sample. So if you can, look to audit more sites, and ensure that the findings from the sites you do audit are communicated across the entire group, so you can replicate savings across the sites which didn't have an audit. And the other thing is looking at aligning the audits with any net zero and environmental goals you have, and making sure the auditors are including those in the audit findings, and they're taking consideration of what your net zero goals are. And obviously the audits can form part of a gap analysis, net zero gap analysis, or a net zero action plan. So it's a sort of double bang for your buck, so to speak. And then Gary mentioned this as well, but I think this is extremely important. Don't just look at technological opportunities, you know, like upgrading air compressors or improved boilers. Also look at behavioral change and how engaging with your staff and your employees, and changing how they behave can help reduce energy and consumption and carbon emissions. Right, next slide, please. So also there's no point doing the ESOS and getting the opportunities if you don't implement them. So you need to be looking at producing an implementation plan, and if you can't or you don't have the resources to do the implementation or the knowledge to do the implementation yourself, look to get help from somewhere else. Look at, when you're doing the audits, look at reviewing previous ESOS reports, because there may be opportunities in there that at the time wouldn't fly because the payback was too long or the technology wasn't quite mature enough, but actually, especially given what's happened with utility prices over the last sort of couple of years, a lot of the projects that may not have been viable 4 years ago could quite easily be viable. And actually, the table on the right hand side shows one here, which back in 2019 was a payback of 3.1 years. In 2023, with a quite conservative increase in electricity unit prices, is dropped to 1.7 years. We've also, within that, included a cost of carbon, which I think is something else that's quite important to think about. If you're looking at reducing your carbon emissions, you need to try and set an internal carbon price and say, well, what actually is the cost of carbon to us? And the £85 there I've used is the current 2023 price for opt-out target carbon emissions for the UK ETS. So that's where that's come from, and that's likely to rise even further. I think the predictions in 2025 is £110, something like that, a ton. When you're looking at implementing, sometimes it makes sense to package different opportunities together. So you might have one that has a good carbon saving, but actually the payback isn't as great. If you can package that together with other opportunities that have much better paybacks, it can bring the overall payback down, but the carbon savings are still achieved as well. So that's worth looking at. And also, I'm finding this a lot now, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has gone. So a lot of people now have LEDs in, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to think a little bit more out of the box. And you've got to, when you're doing the auditing, especially if you're doing the auditing in-house yourself, you need to try and think more, go back to a blank sheet, see how you would potentially do something if you were starting from fresh, and then see how you can apply that to what's currently going on in the business. And then the last one is making sure you're investigating all alternatives for funding methods. So potentially internal funding is great, but if you haven't got the funds available, can you look at a power purchase agreement? Can you look at shared savings with an installer? And looking also at grants and other methods of funding to help get those opportunities and those projects implemented. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. That's the end of it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation, Owen. If I could ask you to stay on for our Q&A, and if I could also get Gary, if you could start sharing your audio as well. Thank you everyone watching for providing so many great questions. I've got more than 40 of them, so we're not going to be able to get through all of them in the next 15 minutes. So I'm going to take some of the questions that keep coming up, really. I'm going to start at the beginning. We've had a couple of questions just asking, where on earth do I get started with a lead assessor or auditor? We also have an audience member called Owen who asks, is a lead assessor the same as an auditor? So Owen, for people that are really just getting started, how do you get the ball rolling with your lead assessor?
So a lead assessor is somebody who's qualified to sign off the ESOS assessment and the ESOS evidence pack. An auditor doesn't have to be a lead assessor. Lead assessors are qualified through professional bodies. So I'm qualified through the Energy Institute. You can go online and search. They have registers of lead assessors online. So if you go to the Energy Institute, and there's other professional bodies that also have these lists. I don't know, Gary, do you know specifically, is there a specific central?
No, it's generally, as you say, through the professional bodies, but there is a list of gov.uk of all the professional bodies that are currently active under ESOS.
Yeah.
But it may be worth having a kind of direct dialogue with the professional bodies, particularly if, for example, you have quite a bespoke kind of request in terms of your organization is looking for specialized skills. So it may be worth actually having that dialogue with them. But I think it's certainly something we're thinking about. Could there be a register that kind of was more searchable?
Got it. And similarly, we had a question asking about timing. So should people start to contact a lead assessor and or auditor before the guidance is out in full, Gary, is a question that we've had.
I think yes, partly because we, I guess, have put out through the newsletters the key elements in terms of what is required, in terms of, for example, these are the key elements that would be part of your report that you need to provide to the Environment Agency. So a lot of that is already out there, and quite a lot doesn't change from, I guess, phase 3. I think I'll probably pick up the question about why haven't we waited till phase 4 at the same time. I think we're conscious, the findings that we got from the evaluation, as well as, you know, some of the challenges for affordability on businesses, meant that we thought it was the right time to introduce these changes now. We announced them a year ago, so they've already, been on gov.uk in terms of the approach that we're taking, and we didn't want to wait till 2027 before, the recommendations found their way to the boardroom to be kind of looked at and considered. So I think we were conscious of the need to act now and bring those changes in. But we also recognised, in terms of things like net zero audits, that there are some quite, that's probably a more significant change than disclosing more of what should already have been in your evidence pack, or kind of increasing the de minimis. Remember also that the de minimis is not thou shalt hit 90% exactly. It's, you should do at least 90%, and we're just saying now that should be at least 95% of your total energy consumption. So I think we're conscious of the need to act now, but also we held off in terms of some of the more significant changes like net zero as well as, you know, extending it beyond the current large businesses and their corporate groups, and to something beyond this phase.
Got it. So we've covered some of the questions that came in quite early and quite about the early stages of the process. We've also had lots of questions about ESOS Phase 3 and interoperability with similar certification or obligation and compliance schemes. By far the most common one in the chat, with I think 8 or so questions, is about the overlap, if any, between ESOS and ISO 5001. So Hannah asked how the changes will impact a company's ability to use ISO 5001. We've got other questions about scopes. So
ISO 50001 will still be a compliance route for phase 3 of ESOS. You may, in terms of the information that you collect as part of ISO 50001, be required to include that in the report that you send to the Environment Agency, but ISO 50001 will continue to be a compliance route. I think for phase 4, I think I'd spotted some questions around how that linked in with a new net zero PAS standard. I think that's something that we're working through, because we're conscious that ISO 50001 is an energy management system, so it doesn't necessarily cover net zero. So there may be some elements that you may need to do a top up on top of ISO 50001 to ensure that it gives due regard to net zero in kind of taking forward any recommendations. But that's a phase 4 issue rather than a phase 3 issue.
Got it. Owen, did you have anything to add about interoperability with ISO 5001?
Yeah, I think Gary said it all. Yes, you can still use ISO 50001 to comply. The only thing I would say is obviously that has to cover the whole of your organization. So the ISO 50001 if it only covers certain parts of your organization, you may need to do some audits on the bits of the organization that aren't covered. And obviously with the increase in de minimis, it may have been in phase 2 that other parts of the organization fell under 10%. But May doesn't fall under 5%. So you just need to be aware of that and make sure that you do that check, and that if you do need to do some additional auditing over and above your ISO 50001, then you include that.
And just to add that we will, as part of, I guess, the compliance notification, require you to set out how much of the total energy consumption fits in different categories. So if you've used, you know, audits, ISO 50001, display energy certificates and Green Deal assessments, you would need to kind of set out, as Owen says, how does that map across energy use if it doesn't cover the 100%. And transport is often one of the things that people forget about in terms of it may not be covered in the sites that are currently under the ISO 50001.
Got it, thank you. We've also had some questions about interoperability with SECA, streamlined energy and carbon reporting. So while we're on the topic of different standards, I think we should probably take those as well.
So I think in terms of there's the kind of an element of ESOS is in some ways a 4-yearly element. Yes, there are some action plan elements, but the kind of the total energy consumption assessment is every 4 years. SECR obviously operates on an annual basis, and the kind of qualification are slightly different in terms of one links to, I guess, the requirements under the UK Companies Act, whereas ESOS is a bit wider in terms of undertakings that operate in the UK. I think in certainly developing the IT system, we are looking at, you know, for example, when you do your SECR report on the energy efficiency action you have taken in the last 12 months covered by the reporting period, could you effectively bring across that information from your SECR or ESOS report, or vice versa? But they're in some ways separate legislation, so that you still need to meet the requirements of both. But we're certainly keen to look at the opportunities for, I guess, streamlining and synergies in terms of the different information, and likewise in terms of EPCs and energy performance certificates, etc. Conscious that ESOS is wider than just buildings, and EPCs don't provide, in some ways, an in-use energy reflection. They're more about kind of what measures you put in the building when you kind of have designed it.
That makes sense. Yeah, we did actually get a question about EPC, so that's nice to cover that off across as well. Owen, I just want to come to you for some FAQ that we had about the scope of who needs to prepare for ESOS. So we've had a couple of questions in about the employee count. We've had asked about what to do if your business is multinational, what bits have to be in the UK for you to need to do ESOS work, and what do we do about counting volunteers or part-time staff? I've been asked by someone else in the chat.
Yeah, it can get quite complicated. Basically, it's the average number of employees over the reference period that you've chosen, or over the reporting period that you've chosen. So if you have a seasonal business that has 50 employees during the winter and 600 employees during the summer, you need to average that over a 12-month period to get your total number of employees. With part-time staff, they count as one employee. So part-time, there isn't any reduction for saying somebody only works 2 days a week, so they're only 2/5 of an employee. They all count as a total employee. When you start looking at operations overseas, generally aren't included, but there are some rules that are a little bit different depending on what the operation is, etc. So there's quite a lot of detail to go in. The best thing to be doing is, if you've got a complex situation like that, is contact the Environment Agency help email address and talk them through the exact situation. They should be able to give you guidance, or, as I say, contact the lead assessor who should be able to help you with that specific set of scenarios. Does that?
Great, thank you.
It's also worth adding that there's kind of, in terms of calculating employee numbers, etc., and qualification, the existing guidance on the Environment Agency part of gov.uk provided a fair amount of detail in terms of some of those questions around 250 FTE and how it's calculated, and also things like smoothing provisions where businesses have moved between medium and large status. Generally, there needs to be at least 2 reporting cycles that happens to. So I obviously haven't got time to go into all that detail, but that's kind of one of the things to look at.
Great, no problem. We have only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to sneak one really quick question and then one closing question. The quick one we've had in 3 times. First one I saw was from Anya, who asked Gary about the standardized compliance report template that he mentions. Does he have a timeline on when we'll probably be able to see that?
So I think, as I said, in terms of the newsletter that the Environment Agency put out, that gives the kind of the key areas that the ESOS report will need to include. As I said, once the statutory instrument has completed its passage, and we're hoping that is September or October, then we would look to put updated guidance out. I think if there are particular questions that come into the Environment Agency through their helpline, again, we will look to provide, where we can, information, but obviously can't be seen to prejudice parliamentary process in terms of the kind of royal assent of the energy bill and the kind of publication of the statutory instrument.
Got it, thanks Gary. And I'm just, for our final question of the session, going to come on to one that's getting upvoted really quickly in the chat. Comes from Victoria, who asks, who's responsible for conducting audits when you're in a shared tenant building? What do you do about landlord-tenant relationships? Owen, have you had instances of clients working in these kind of buildings?
Yeah, and again, it's basically coming to an agreement with your landlord on who will take responsibility for that energy use. And if you can't get an agreement, then it is down to you to cover it. But you can agree between yourselves and the landlord, the tenants and the landlord, whether they will cover it within their operations or whether you cover it within yours. Obviously, with tenant landlord situations, it can be quite difficult for the tenant to get energy data out of the landlord, especially if they're being recharged on a square meterage basis. But it's trying to, talk and negotiate with your landlord and agree on a way forward on the best way of doing it. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules around it. Gary, are you aware of? That's the way certainly we've dealt with it in the past.
So I guess in the end, it comes down to who is responsible for it, and the kind of, as you say, the agreement on that. It may come down to things like what is in the contract between yourselves and the landlord, because we're aware there are kind of multitude of different arrangements that may be in place.
Yeah. Unfortunately, can't really tell you. It's a case by case basis on those ones, but generally, usually is the tenant takes responsibility for it in my experience.
Got it. Thank you. We always get questions about these complex sites or letted sites, so thank you for taking that question on. We are now past the 1:45 p.m. mark, so I'm going to have to bring the session to a close shortly. Thank you everyone for tuning in and for submitting so many great questions. There was too many to take simply. I know that Owen put his contact on his slides, so I'm sure he'd be more than happy to follow up. I'm getting lots of clapping and thumbs up emojis. Great to see so many of you online. So thanks once again for tuning in. Thanks also to both Gary and Owen for taking the time to present this afternoon, and of course to JRP Solutions for partnering with us to make this session possible. Just before we sign off, just to recap, this session has been recorded and will shortly be making it available to watch on demand at your leisure. You'll be emailed information on how to do that before the week is out, and we'll also be publishing that information on our homepage. If you know someone who would have benefited from tuning in live, you can share those links with them and they can register to watch retrospectively on demand. Once the session finishes, you'll be emailed a survey so you can let us know what went well and how we can make our next masterclass webinar even better. That should only take a minute, so please do take the time to complete that. For now, though, that's all from me and that's all from our speakers. Thank you so much for joining me, and it's goodbye from me.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.